Hi again then guys, and welcome to episode 20 of Days Gone By, the review series for Gran Turismo's selection of classic and also vintage cars. And in this particular pick we're featuring a vehicle which, although doesn't see a huge amount of use by many people, does certainly have its uses. And the car in question is a small Alfa Romeo, quite a sporty and good looking car, called the Giulia, and this particular model is the Sprint Speciale from 1963, and it's a car which is, as I said, kind of overlooked. There are certainly fans of the car, but many people tend to go for the Sprint GT6 for obvious reasons. It's the better known car from a competition point of view, and it also has a more impressive overall appearance. It looks more like a chunky performance machine, whereas this car looks certainly good looking, but it's a little bit more delicate looking. Almost more like an art piece, whereas the Sprint GTA looks more like a car that will get the job done. It has a similar shape and style to the BMW 2002 Turbo, and just like that car, it is very good, and we will of course feature that car in this series as well. For now though, we have the Giulia. So the question is, what do you get from the car? Well, for a start, there's the price. At 62 grand, this car's actually pretty good value. Now 62 grand is a lot compared to what you can get for less if you're talking pure performance, but for a classic, especially a classic Italian car that looks as good as this, especially being a special version, that's not a bad price at all. And as I mentioned earlier on in the video, I believe that this car has some very specific uses, if you will, and has a very specific audience which it could be beneficial for. And one of those is people who are fans of the Abarth 1500 by Posto. That car is very cool, it's one of my personal favourite classics in the game, but it's also very expensive. 3.5 million credits is not exactly affordable for the majority of players, and if you do have that kind of cash, relatively few people are going to spend that on the Abarth. They may buy it eventually, but if you've got that kind of money, there are probably other vehicles which you would buy before it. This car is very similar to that car, not just in the way it looks, its overall shape, but also in its performance and spec. It's actually a very, very similar car to the Biposto. Now, in terms of engine, you get a 1.6 litre naturally aspirated unit. It's front mounted and it's rear wheel drive. It doesn't put out a huge amount of power, 222 horsepower fully tuned, and the torque is also not particularly amazing at 167 foot-pounds. It does only weigh 835 kilos though, which is pretty good, and puts out 266 horsepower per tonne, which is roughly the kind of horsepower per tonne you'd expect from, say, an impressive low to mid-range in terms of size hot hatch or a smaller sports car. As far as PP, fully tuned, it sits at 443, which is actually quite good. I would have personally predicted that this car would have a higher PP than that, maybe closer to 560, but the fact that it is that low could prove very useful depending on how good it is. So that is the question. How good is this car? Is it quick? Does it have good handling? Or is it just basically an art piece, which isn't necessarily a bad thing? There are certainly vehicles which are primarily better to look at and drive for fun rather than necessarily race, and I would actually include the Abarth by Posto in that category. It is much more of a collector's machine than a race car. Well, this vehicle is potentially a good car for competition. It's not its ideal use. I would say that primarily this is more of a collector's car than it is a track machine, but under the right circumstances you certainly could use this car in racing. I would recommend racing this car, if you do plan to do so, at basically up to 425 pp. Any higher than that and you start to get vehicles which can outclass it, whereas in the lower levels it allows you to have a car which has advantages which are still relevant, such as that low weight, because when you get into the really, really low PP levels, horsepower doesn't really have as much of a bearing, because none of the cars have a huge amount of power at that level. So the fact that this car isn't hugely powerful doesn't matter as much. Whereas, of course, if you were trying to race cars, let's say 450 pp, it's going to struggle. Overall, the handling is, I would say, very good in the case of this car. It does have a slight inclination to be a little bit tail happy, which isn't too surprising given that it's a classic, it's lightweight, and it's rear-wheel drive. But overall, the handling is certainly very good. It can not necessarily out-handle everything, but the handling's more than good enough. It's very fun to drive, it takes corners in a very sharp, I would say actually quite focused way, which is surprising for a classic which could easily be very wallowy, but that's not the case with this car. Overall, it's a car which I'm not going to say will beat any other classic, because it's quite simply not. It's a good car, but it's not an amazing one. If you are looking to buy this car, I would say, as with some other vehicles that I've reviewed in the past, it's more a vehicle to buy if you're a collector. You like classics, for instance, you like collecting classics, you like cars that look good, you like cars for cruising, just for the fun of driving, then it will appeal to you and you will enjoy owning this car. If you're more the kind of person who buys a classic like any other car purely because of what it can do for you in terms of racing and outright performance, well then not so much, but overall that's probably not too surprising that I'd say that. If this car could be turbo or supercharged, it would be a different story, but given the naturally aspirated power, it's not bad, especially for a naturally aspirated engine, but it does limit its potential somewhat. But that's it overall for this particular pick. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.